go on to Mr. Genuis.
Well, Mr. Chair, we know that the Minister of Foreign Affairs has champagne tastes in London flats, but it's his champagne mortgages that Canadians are concerned about. Specifically, why did the minister only disclose the complete extent of his personal debt to the Chinese government on June the 4th of this year?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as you know, since entering politics, the two mortgages and the other liabilities and assets from the minister have been fully disclosed to the Ethics Commission and placed on the online public registry, Mr. Speaker. It's public, Mr. Speaker, public.
Mr. Genuis.
Now it's public and it's terrible. But really, when will the Foreign Affairs Minister be here to answer these questions himself?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's always been public. Now the question is, we're in the middle of a pandemic here, Mr. Speaker. We are here trying to help Canadians, and the best they can do is ask questions.
Go back to Mr. Genuis. Mr. Genuis.
When the minister owes over $1 million to the Chinese government, people have a right to ask him questions. When will the Minister of Foreign Affairs show up?
The Honourable Minister.
The minister shows up every day, Mr. Speaker. He shows up and works for Canadians, Mr. Speaker. And once again, those are public documents. Everything that the minister did is public, Mr. Speaker. I still don't know why they ask.
We'll now go back to Mr. Genuis.
Mr. Chair, he doesn't even have to come to the House. All he has to do is appear on the screen. Where is the minister? Why is he hiding? Why won't he answer questions about his personal debt to the Chinese government?
The Honourable Minister.
Let's go online. He's going to get the information.
Mr. Genuis.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is hiding. Let's ask some specific questions about their China policy. What is the impact on the decision-making? 3/4 of Canadians don't want Huawei involved in our 5G network. So will the minister put the interests of Canadians ahead of the interests of his creditors and say no to Huawei?
The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to 5G deployment, we are right now currently undergoing a comprehensive review. We have been absolutely clear with our allies and with Canadians that we never have and never will compromise Canadians' national interests.
Back to Mr. Genuis.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is not an answer, and it is completely out of step with what our allies have already recognized. Reports are emerging of multiple deadly viruses exported from Winnipeg's microbiology lab to the Wuhan Institute of Virology right before scientists were expelled for policy breaches. In spite of that, scientific cooperation between Canadian institutions and military-affiliated Wuhan Institute of Virology is continuing. So why hasn't the government put in place new guidelines to prevent the export of sensitive pathogens and information to China?
The Honourable Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And he's right. In 2019, the National Microbiology Lab shared lab samples with the Wuhan Institute of Virology. The National Microbiology Lab routinely shares samples with other labs to help advance the international community's understanding of viruses and the research that is ongoing around those viruses. There are strict protocols in place for these transfers, and these samples were transported according to Canadian laws and regulations.
Mr. Genuis.
Mr. Chair, I think Canadians would be concerned to hear that it's routine for the transport of viruses to Chinese military-affiliated labs. When Champagne was the Parliamentary Secretary for Finance, the government decided to give hundreds of millions of dollars to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, bankrolling Chinese state-controlled development projects in Asia with weak labour, human rights and environmental standards. Will the minister put Canadian taxpayers ahead of his personal creditors and support a pullout from the Communist Party-controlled development bank?
The Honourable Minister.
Once again, Mr. Speaker, I mean, the colleagues trying to connect the dots, and, you know, I don't know exactly where he's going from here, but everything is public, and there's a thing called Google. He can go on it and check the information.
We'll go to Mr. Genuis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The public can listen to this, and I'm sure this exchange will also be available on Google, and the public can draw their own conclusions. We have failures on 5G, failures when it comes to the transport of deadly viruses, and failures when it comes to giving over $400 million to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's clear that the Bank of China's investment in Minister Champagne is paying off. It's time for the minister to settle his debt with the communist government and not settle it on the back of Canadians. When will the minister be here in the House and answer questions about this mortgage?
The Honourable Minister.
Colleagues should be cautious with what he's saying in the House, Mr. Speaker. This is serious stuff, so he should be careful what he says. And the minister is actually working extremely hard for all Canadians, doing his job correctly, Mr. Speaker, and we're talking about public information. Once again, let him go to Google and Google it. That's it.
Now we'll go to